Before we get into today's story, I want to tell you about a podcast called Key to the Case. Each week, host Sam and Sean discuss an unsolved mystery, like the murders of Lisa Drury and Brandon Rumbaugh, a young couple who was killed while sleeping in the remote Arizona desert. A disposable camera found at the crime scene captured some of their final moments. Sam and Sean thoughtfully highlight cases that have received little coverage. I enjoyed Key to the Case, and I know you will too. You can find Key to the Case wherever you listen to podcasts. This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. In 1979, a prominent counterfeiter attracted the attention of the US Secret Service. While many of us associate the Secret Service with the protection of the president and think of them to be a standalone agency, until 2003 they were a part of the US Department of Treasury. As such, they investigated things like counterfeit currency. They still do to this day, just not under the purview of the Treasury Department, but rather under the expanse of Homeland Security. They also investigate more than just presidential threats or counterfeit currency. Cybercrimes, identity theft, things of that nature. When someone attempts to defraud the US government in some way, the Secret Service usually gets involved. Well, in 1979, someone began creating and distributing their own counterfeit $20 bills, which popped up all along the East Coast, the Midwest, and the South, throughout most of the continental United States actually. Almost always in shopping centers or malls. Charles Fells, the assistant U.S. attorney from Tennessee, would later state, "His technique was to go from shopping center to shopping center, passing phony notes at malls. You can pass $20 bills in a real hurry that way." This individual, who would earn the nickname the Mall Passer due to their tactics, had created their own $20 bills, which all shared the same noticeable flaws, suggesting they all came from the same source. This individual would then use these $20 bills to pay for a relatively cheap item, maybe something at a store that only cost a couple of bucks, and then get back nearly the same amount in real cash. It was counterfeiting and money laundering, and in isolation was a pretty harmless crime. After all, businesses were losing less than $20 a pop. But the widespread distribution of these counterfeit bills insinuated that this was a more wide-ranging scam than investigators ever could have envisioned when the first few bills popped up in 1979. By 1983, the Mall Passer had distributed these $20 bills throughout 44 states, and an analysis from the Secret Service projected that the offender was earning more than $130,000 a year through this scheme alone, with the bills showing up in the bank deposits of not just big box stores, but mom-and-pop shops throughout America. The year prior, 1982, had seen federal agents distribute sketches of the assumed Mall Passer to store clerks throughout the US, and businesses everywhere were told to contact law enforcement if someone matching the description tried to pass a bill that looked imperfect. This would eventually lead to the arrest of a man in Tennessee in May of 1983, but through that arrest, authorities ended up learning much more than they ever expected to. Part 1. The Mall Passer. April 14th, 1865 is a defining day in American history. Not only is it the day in which President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, but it is also the day that the Secret Service was first pitched at a cabinet meeting in the White House. Surprisingly, as noted by author Stephen Michaud, who wrote the defining book on this story, Beyond Cruel, the two events are unrelated. Following the 4-year U.S. Civil War, counterfeit currency was plentiful. It was rumored that roughly 1/3 of all currency in circulation at the time was fake. So in the aforementioned cabinet meeting, it was determined that the US government should develop an agency with the sole purpose of regulating the nation's currency and combating counterfeits, no longer entrusting this effort to local law enforcement, who seemed to tackle it on a case-by-case basis and were clearly getting overwhelmed. Rather, this would let the federal government take the initiative and develop efforts to combat the growing problem before it devalued the US currency to an extreme degree. As it happened, President Lincoln was assassinated later that evening by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. But hours beforehand, Lincoln had established a commission to fix the problem, and nearly 3 months later, on July 5, 1865, the Secret Service was established. Because of its original role, the Secret Service was incorporated as part of the Department of Treasury. At the time, it was one of the first handful of federal law enforcement agencies, joining the Customs Service, the Park Police, what we now refer to as the Postal Inspection Service, and the Marshal Service. Because it was one of the first handful of federal crime-fighting agencies, the Secret Service did more than just combat issues involving counterfeit currencies. They also aided the U.S. Marshals in crimes ranging from murder to illegal gambling. But they did make crimes involving counterfeit currency their primary focus. Following the death of Abraham Lincoln, the newly minted Secret Service would unofficially aid in protecting and defending the president, but that would not become an official part of their organizational duties until the 20th century, following the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901. Those duties would later get extended to presidential candidates and their families in the 1960s, following the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. In the years since, the Secret Service has even gotten involved in combating cybercrime, and has since been transferred from the Department of Treasury to the Department of Homeland Security. But at the time this story unfolds, they were still a part of Treasury, and weren't yet engaged in investigating or deterring cybercrimes. In August of 1979, authorities became aware of a new counterfeiter who had started out their spree by distributing bogus bills at a Florence mall in the Kentucky town of the same name. They were $20 bills that looked real, for the most part. Those unfamiliar with counterfeits probably would not notice the difference between it and a regular $20 bill. However, just a day or so after it had been used, the fake was noticed by a bank teller, who immediately contacted the Secret Service. Once investigators and analysts with the Secret Service got their hands on it, they noticed the flaws. It had clearly not been printed by the US Treasury. It did not have the raised ink printed onto legit bills, so it felt flat, not textured. Whoever had created it had tried to simulate the look of regular $20 bills, but they used red and blue ink to try and recreate it. Those who glanced at the bill might not notice, but the discrepancies could be picked up easily by those with a keen eye for counterfeits. James E. Brown of the Secret Service's Forensic Services Division would later recall to author Stephen Michaud in his book Lethal Shadow. This may have been an average counterfeit, maybe a 4 or a 6 on a scale of 10. If I were to compare it to some of the best notes we've seen, maybe I'd move it down to a 2. But in counterfeiting, quality is not everything. Remember, you only have to fool someone with it one time. Obviously, this note was good enough. Throughout the rest of the year, bills began to crop up throughout the US, spreading out from the Cincinnati region where they had first began to be noticed. A single witness described the man who had passed the bills as a pretty mundane-looking white man, but that was obviously not much to work with. Other incidents involving the bills were muddled, with witnesses not recalling who had given them the bills or where they had been used. For the most part, no one really noticed that these were fraudulent bills until they were turned into the banks, at which point they would then get flagged. Attempts to jog cashiers' memories days, maybe even weeks later, were unsuccessful more often than not. At that point, trying to determine who had handed over the bills would be like trying to find raindrops in the ocean. Months later, bills began to get turned into states along the East Coast, including New Jersey and Pennsylvania. These bills were slightly different than the first in some minor ways, but bore many similarities. They had likely been made in a separate batch, but had the same hallmarks of their maker, meaning that whoever this was not just a standalone printing. This was an ongoing scam. In 1980, bills began to pop up all over. They were reported in states such as North Carolina, Virginia, Ohio, Delaware, Missouri, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, to name a few. A small collection of bills would be used in a variety of stores within a single city, and then they would disappear, only to then resurface in a city dozens or hundreds of miles away, days, maybe weeks later. This indicated that whoever this was likely a traveling counterfeiter who moved from location to location and then back again, trying to complete some kind of loop. By the end of the year, per the book Beyond Cruel, this counterfeiter had distributed roughly $30,000 of fraudulent bills in 38 states. Yet whoever this was, they were just getting started. Since the Secret Service had a long history of investigating counterfeit currency dating back to the 19th century, they had dealt with a lot of counterfeits beforehand. The first bills produced by this counterfeiter were the 7,215th specific counterfeit that they had come across in the agency's history, so that identifier would be used to mark this case. Any subsequent bills or batches of bills would end up getting linked to case 7215. The Secret Service would begin to learn everything they could about the bills that they found, how they had been made, what dyes the counterfeiter was using, what printing machine they had likely printed it on, how they'd tried to ruffle it to make it look authentic, etc. While analysts took on the scientific details of the bills themselves, investigators set out to find out where they had come from and who had been responsible. However, that would be a lot easier said than done, and would begin a painstaking process that would take years. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment to hear a word from today's sponsors. As I mentioned just a few minutes ago, one witness had reported seeing the man identified as the mall passer back in 1979, providing law enforcement with enough information to put together a rough description. But additional descriptions of this individual would not surface until 1981, nearly 2 years later. A cashier at a donut shop in Burnside, Minnesota noticed that the $20 bill she had been handed was fake, and turned to confront the individual who had given it to her. But within a moment, he had already left the store, and was seen driving away by a second witness. The cashier described him as a 35 to 40-year-old Caucasian male, who stood about 6 feet tall and weighed roughly 170 pounds, with dark hair that was graying, blue eyes, and was driving a dark blue Ford Thunderbird. This description was given some added credence when another sighting was reported days later, roughly 1,000 miles away. A teller out in Aurora, Colorado recalled a nearly identical encounter by a man matching the same description. However, this time the man was reported as having a thin frame and wearing wire-rimmed glasses. Based on this, it seemed like the mall passer added props or makeup at different places to augment his look, so that no two descriptions were ever the same. But the bare bones were there. In December of 1981, the following article was published in the Leader-Telegram from up in Wisconsin. The U.S. Secret Service has notified Eau Claire police that a man has been passing counterfeit $20 bills in Minnesota and is now believed to be headed for Wisconsin. The man passes the bogus bills only in shopping centers. The $20 bills start with serial number of B, J, C, or K. The bogus bill passer is about 35 years old and 6 feet tall, has short black hair with a touch of gray and a light complexion, and wears wire-rimmed glasses, the Secret Service said. He is believed to be driving a dark blue full-sized car, possibly a 1977 or 1978 Ford Thunderbird. Anyone who receives these bills or becomes suspicious of someone trying to cash a $20 bill should call the police department immediately at 8 and find out the make and license number of the person's car. At around the same time, a similar article was published in the Courier Post, all the way out in South Jersey. That article named the offender as shopping mall bill passer based on the way he had carried out his crimes, and described him as a neatly dressed man in his mid-30s who had made purchases at several stores inside of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware shopping malls for months using his custom-made $20 bills, a factor that made his case rather unusual for the Secret Service agents investigating it. Usually, the way these crimes worked is that there was a printer, someone that made the counterfeit currency. This in and of itself was something that took a lot of work, despite the innate insinuation that it didn't. Trying to make authentic-looking currency took a lot of legwork, a lot of practice, and a lot of trial and error. And the stakes were massive. Printing counterfeit currency could earn you years in federal prison. But after printing the bills, the printers typically relied on someone else for distribution. Likely, they would print off a batch of bills, maybe like $10,000 worth, and then sell it to someone for a fraction of legitimate currency, say $1,000. Through them, this counterfeit currency would get distributed, thus making it harder to determine who had printed it. However, because of the distribution, authorities could usually work their way up the counterfeit totem pole, eventually finding the distributor and through them, the printer. But the case of the mall passer was unique. The Secret Service began to theorize early on that one man had been making his own counterfeit currency and then distributing it himself through a series of dozens, if not hundreds or even thousands, of face-to-face encounters, all of which took place in shopping malls across America. It was almost dizzying in scope. Special Agent Kevin Tucker told reporters, "He'll only pass 5 or 6 notes at a time, then come back a month later and pass 5 or 6 more." A Secret Service spokesman told reporters with the Lancaster New Era over in Pennsylvania, "He usually goes into a store, buys an item costing maybe $2, and gives the clerk a $20 bill. He actually buys something rather than ask for change." That was one of the factors that seemed to differentiate this scheme from others like it. Typically, people trying to pass off counterfeit currency would just ask for change, but this man would try and purchase something small, maybe a pair of socks, a greeting card, a magazine, and then just pocket the change. Those who had encountered this man, the mall passer, were clerks, cashiers, and tellers. They all described him as a well-mannered man who wasn't greedy. Nothing about him outwardly seemed to be a con artist. He was usually well-dressed and cordial, but that may have played in his favor. Those who received the bills were less likely to call him out because of his meek manner. At least 15 different salespeople or cashiers had interacted directly with this man, and they all made note of the man's appearance and later told authorities, leading to a sketch of the suspect being distributed throughout 1982, glasses and all. At this point, authorities had picked up on some of the offender's habits. They noticed that in most of the encounters he had had with cashiers, he had gone out of his way to approach a young female cashier. He would likely be able to intimidate them a little bit, being a well-dressed older man. Investigators wondered if this scheme had proven less successful with male or older female tellers, who'd be more likely to take a look at the $20 bills they had been handed and call out the offender on them. This was a type of social engineering that he had likely been utilizing for some time to ensure success. The mall passer also seemed to try and pick busier times for the businesses that he laundered his counterfeits through, during which he was less likely to draw a critical eye. He came in during peak hours to ensure that cashiers were in a bit of a hurry, and also seemed to utilize holiday weekends as an opportunity to launder multiple $20 bills at various mall shops. However, the distances that this individual seemed to travel beggared belief. The mall passer would pass bills in one area, and then seemingly do the same thing hundreds of miles away just hours later. This led to the theory that he spent most of the year traveling, leading to multiple theories about what he did for an actual job. A popular theory emerged among Secret Service agents that this had been a pilot, but even they began to speculate that one of their own might have been responsible. After all, the offender seemed to utilize I-95 for a lot of his travels along the East Coast, leading to the theory that he lived in or near Washington, D.C. In the early months of 1983, the mall passer investigation had been ongoing for nearly 4 years, yet authorities with the Secret Service were no closer to catching him than they had been back in 1979. They had had some success in obtaining physical descriptions of the man, which they had then disseminated to various shops and business owners throughout America, but they still had no working theory on who this infamous counterfeiter was. However, the Secret Service agents overseeing this investigation had a hunch, and it centered around the mall passer's travel habits. Based on the way he often traveled, they began to speculate where he would head to next. Because, try as he might to remain anonymous, his habits had become known to the investigators hunting him. They could tell that he traveled in some kind of sequence, usually heading back to his assumed home near Washington, D.C. in December, and then hitting the road again in January. So based on that, and where the counterfeit bills would be reported afterward, they could begin to chart some kind of speculative roadmap for where he would go to next. So early on in 1983, members of the Secret Service traveled out to Tennessee, where they theorized that the mall passer might be heading soon. They began to meet with shop owners and business leaders, informing them of this counterfeiter and his likely emergence in the area. Because of his prior usage of bogus $20 bills in this region, he would likely return soon and try to implement his scheme yet again. Just a couple of months later, their hunch would prove correct. On May 24, 1983, the mall passer walked into a bookstore in Tennessee and attempted to buy a magazine with a bogus $20 bill. The cashier who interacted with him, Donna Cooper, later told the Kingsport Times-News, "I acted dumb and tried to stall him. I had to turn my back on him to get to the phone. He hung around for a while. He was determined, but after a while he left." A Kingsport, Tennessee police officer actually gave chase to the offender and nearly caught him, but the mall passer managed to slip away yet again. Despite that, however, authorities were now aware of his presence in the area, and members of the Secret Service began staffing malls throughout East Tennessee, leading to their suspect's capture the very next day. That's after the break. On Wednesday, May 25, 1983, Secret Service agents posted themselves up in malls throughout eastern Tennessee, waiting for the call from any local businesses that spotted the man identified as the mall passer. Just minutes after arriving at the Foothills Mall in Maryville, Tennessee, roughly 15 miles south of Knoxville, the call came in. A manager working at a nearby Walden Books had interacted with a man attempting to buy a cheap paperback, who handed over what appeared to be a counterfeit $20 bill. The manager let the purchase go through as normal, but set aside the $20 bill, knowing that the culprit's fingerprints were still on it. Secret Service agents began to coordinate with mall security and the local police department to try and detain the man without incident. However, after noticing the increased scrutiny, or perhaps suspecting that he was still being followed, the man they were tailing began running off, fleeing toward a vacant hallway. Security and investigators gave chase, and through mere luck, were able to send a couple of Maryville police officers to the exterior doors, where the culprit ran right into them. At first, he tried to bluff his way past the officers, but was physically detained and held until the Secret Service agents could catch up. When apprehended, the man told police that his name was Roger Colin Blanchard, which fit the ID card that he was carrying on his person, which said that he was from Charlotte, North Carolina. But the man refused to give up any more information about himself and seemed utterly uncooperative with authorities. He carried 2 sets of car keys with him at the time, including one emblazoned with a Chrysler logo, but he refused to identify which vehicle was his. After his detainment, officers found a handgun in one of his coat pockets. During questioning, the man continued to insist that his name was Roger Colin Blanchard, but misidentified some of the information from his driver's license. He got the birth date wrong, correctly stating the month and the year, but misidentifying the day. A check of the home address listed on the ID card showed that it was a motel in Charlotte, North Carolina. The owners of the motel were not familiar with a Roger Blanchard, leading investigators to believe that this was a fake identity. Investigators would return to the parking lot hours later, after all of the mall-goers had gone home, leaving behind just a handful of vehicles. One of the vehicles left behind, a Chrysler, was parked near where the individual had been heading to through the vacant hallway when he fled from law enforcement earlier that afternoon. A check of the keys showed that they worked. This was the offender's car. However, a check of the vehicle's registration showed that it belonged to someone else, not a Roger Blanchard from Charlotte, North Carolina, but rather it belonged to a James Richard Jones from Alexandria, Virginia. After obtaining a search warrant, investigators began to look through the vehicle and were surprised at the story they found within. The license plates on the vehicle did not match it. They had evidently been stolen from another vehicle sometime beforehand. Inside the car they found 20 different license plates from 14 different states, all of which were stolen. They also found 7 additional driver's licenses, each belonging to a different identity. An additional handgun was found inside the vehicle, and suspiciously they found a collection of women's underwear. Surprisingly, investigators found that the man they had detained had built in a police siren and a spotlight within the vehicle. He also had a blue police light that he could affix to the car, along with a police lieutenant's badge and a police ID. It was evident that this man had been posing as a police officer in the past, but why? The most surprising discovery from the vehicle came in the form of a detailed ledger, which included the numerous identities donned by this offender and where he had used them throughout his travels. He seemed to keep tabs on which identities he had used in which cities on certain dates, that kind of thing. But he also had weird markings or notes that investigators couldn't immediately explain. In total, they would find that this man had used at least 28 different identities that he kept detailed notes on to ensure which aspects of the identities remained consistent. He had also tracked which hotels and motels he had stayed at recently, their prices during his stay, and the dates that he had been in various towns. For investigators, this ledger was a goldmine. They really couldn't have imagined something more incriminating. Well, I guess that's not exactly correct, because when he was detained, this mysterious individual had been carrying 13 counterfeit $20 bills in his pockets, and they found more than $4,500 worth of these bills in his vehicle. After an examination, these bills would prove consistent with the bogus ones turned into the Secret Service over the previous 4 years, as well as the fake $20 bill handed to the Walden Books manager on May 25th, which had the offender's fingerprints on them. Needless to say, after months of attempting to track down this infamous counterfeiter, investigators had their guy dead to rights. But even after his capture, this man refused to give up his true identity, insisting that his name was Roger Blanchard. He even insisted that this was his name to his court-appointed attorney, until it became apparent that the jig was up. After testing his fingerprints, authorities were able to determine that the man they had arrested was James Mitchell DeBardeleben, who usually went by the nickname Mike and lived in Alexandria, Virginia. Surprisingly at first, police records showed that Mike had been deceased for a few years, but that was due to a mix-up from 1979, in which DeBardeleben's fingerprints were mistaken with those of a Connecticut man. However, this was a bridge that they would cross once they got to it. As far as investigators were concerned, they had their guy, and that's all that mattered. As stated by U.S. Secret Service agent Thomas J. Bondurant to the Kingsport Times-News, he was the most wanted individual in the Secret Service files. James Mitchell DeBardeleben, aka Mike DeBardeleben, was a known criminal. He had been convicted of theft back in 1963, which earned him 2 years in prison. He had even been convicted of passing counterfeit $100 bills back in 1976, which earned him 3 years in federal prison. However, he had been released after less than 2 years, 23 months to be precise, and then spent some time in a halfway house. After his arrest for that crime, a printing press had been discovered in his home, and it was believed that he had been using a similar scheme for this one-man counterfeiting operation. DeBardeleben also had a storied history of violent crime, including assault, sexual assault, and attempted murder. But based on the Secret Service mission statement, those were an afterthought up to this point. Investigators had been hunting him for his counterfeit cash, and up until this arrest, authorities had no reason to believe that the criminal they identified as the mall passer had committed any violent crimes during his counterfeit spree. After his arrest in May of 1983, authorities moved full steam ahead with counterfeit charges, charging Mike DeBardeleben with passing fraudulent bills in the state of Tennessee. That alone would get him a lengthy prison sentence, and gave the Secret Service the time they needed to learn more about his printing operation. Surprisingly, Mike DeBardeleben waived his right to a jury trial, and was tried by federal judge Robert L. Taylor on a 9-count indictment that summer. At the conclusion of his trial, DeBardeleben was found guilty for passing the bogus bills at various stores, including Dalton's Bookshop in Kingsport, T-Shirt Plus and Darden's in Johnson City, and Walden Books in Maryville. He was also found guilty for possessing more than $5,500 in counterfeit bills and for carrying a firearm, a constitutional right that did not exist for felons. In total, he was found guilty on 6 counts of counterfeiting, plus 1 count of carrying a loaded gun. Yet, sentencing was to be deferred, pending a more extensive background investigation, likely something that DeBardeleben had been hoping to avoid. You see, he had some pretty big skeletons that he wanted to keep in his metaphorical closet, and he likely knew that if federal investigators discovered any hint of them, then the counterfeiting crimes that he had been convicted of were the least of his problems. hence his insistence, or what seems like it decades later, to move this trial along as quickly as possible. However, at this point, the damage was already done. When it came time for Mike DeBardeleben's sentencing, prosecutors submitted evidence they'd found while searching for how his counterfeit bills had been printed. It all began at the time he had first been arrested, just outside of the Foothills Mall in May of that year, as described by U.S. Attorney Charles Fells, while officers searched DeBardeleben. They found what can be tactfully characterized as homemade pornographic pictures in his wallet. However, that was just the tip of the iceberg. While searching his vehicle, as I mentioned minutes ago, authorities had discovered a collection of women's underwear. That, along with the fake police equipment, led to some troubling theories about what else Mike DeBardeleben had been up to since his release from prison in 1978. But after finding his vehicle, police discovered that it was registered to his fake identity, James R. Jones, who reportedly lived at 201 South Reynolds Street in Alexandria, Virginia. While searching his home just outside of Washington, D.C., authorities discovered proof of DeBardeleben's counterfeit scheme. There, they found roughly $500,000 in counterfeit bills that were in various forms of completion, and even discovered some cassette tapes recorded by DeBardeleben himself, in which he described how he planned to manufacture and pass off the counterfeit bills as legitimate. They also found a large amount of supplies needed to manufacture counterfeit bills, such as paper, ink, plates, colors, negatives, photo equipment, and cutting materials, along with fraudulent identification documents such as driver's licenses, automobile registrations, and credit cards belonging to multiple identities. However, missing from the scene was a printing machine. So authorities had almost everything they needed to pin DeBardeleben for multiple counterfeiting crimes, but they wanted to learn how he had actually printed the bills. Until they found out, they couldn't rule him out having a partner or an accomplice of some kind. While searching his home in Alexandria, police discovered a phone book, which they began to thumb through. They eventually stopped in the moving and storage section, where they found a small piece of paper stuck inside. Acting upon their intuition, investigators speculated that DeBardeleben may have kept his printing machine in a storage facility. So they began reaching out to various storage facilities in the area, and eventually found one that rented out a storage locker to James R. Jones, one of DeBardeleben's aliases. Members of the Secret Service obtained a search warrant for Locker 230 at the Landmark Mini Storage Facility in Alexandria, Virginia, and began carrying out their search at 8 p.m. on May 28, 1983, just days after DeBardeleben's arrest. They would attempt to search through the dim light of the evening, but had to call off their search of the locker at around 11 p.m. What they had found up to that point, however, shocked them. Inside of the storage locker, investigators had found evidence linking Mike DeBardeleben to additional crimes that were far beyond the scope of the Secret Service. Crimes that were much more than just counterfeit bills. Instead, what they had found was proof of widespread assault, rape, and possibly even murder. Per U.S. Attorney Charles Fells, as reported by the Charlotte News, they discovered correlations between his travels and unsolved murders and rapes. There's a lot of reason to believe he was involved in those crimes. Among the evidence that investigators found in DeBardeleben's storage locker were cassette tapes and photographs that he had made, which showed him carrying out these crimes against dozens of women. He photographed and recorded what appeared to be dozens of rapes, as well as various forms of assault and torture. Very few of the acts depicted in the audio recordings seemed to be between two consenting adults. Most were clearly not. At the sentencing hearing for his counterfeit crimes, DeBardeleben insisted that the allegations from the Secret Service agents who searched his storage locker were outright lies, and claimed, "I'm not guilty of any of them. You're making up some of that. I'd swear on a Bible. Take a lie detector test." However, per U.S. Attorney Charles Fells, James DeBardeleben is as cold as they come. He's very calculating, and certainly not a fool. He spent an awful long time figuring out how to play his game to his advantage. He's obsessed with details. Federal Judge Robert Taylor, after examining this evidence, described the defendant, Mike DeBardeleben, as one of the worst records that's ever been presented to this court, and sentenced him to more than 20 years behind bars in a federal prison. This ensured that a continued investigation could take place, during which DeBardeleben would be powerless to prevent authorities from digging further into his past to determine just how much of a monster he had been. FBI official Chuck Richards later told the Charlotte News, "He's in custody. There's no worry that he's running anywhere. We're motoring along, turning over every stone, and still trying to determine if he should be charged with any other federal crimes." That's on the next episode of Unresolved. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Unresolved. In case this is your first time listening, I have been your host, Michael Whelan. Like most episodes of Unresolved, this episode was researched, written, and produced by myself. I also put together the music heard throughout the episode, except where noted in the show notes. The producers of the show, who support the show each month on Patreon, are Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaratolo, Brandy Nordine, Jacinta Klass, Alex Kellergopoulos, Scott Meesey, Ben Crocum, Patrick Loxo, Marion Welsh, Lauren Nicole, Sally Ranford, Ridis Baugh, James Weiss, Stephen Diaz, Derek Smith, Heather Fiddler, Crystal J, and Zach Cass. Thank you all for your continued support. It really does keep the show alive. I'd also like to thank the rest of the patrons who support the show each month on Patreon. You can become a producer or a patron by heading to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can get access to our entire archive of bonus episodes, as well as episodes of the Patreon exclusive show, Resolved, where I take a look at solved cases. For everyone else, thanks for listening. Make sure to continue spreading word of the podcast with your friends, family, on social media, or wherever you get a chance. Thanks for those of you who do. And a special thanks to those of you who are continuing to give the podcast great reviews on Apple Podcast or other podcast platforms. Those really do go a long way. Anyway, this is part 1 of what should be a multi-part series. I'm not quite sure how many episodes it'll be when it's all said and done, but right now we're looking at least 3 episodes so far. Sorry I can't be more forthcoming at this time, but the crimes of Mike DeBardeleben are so insane that I'm still in the process of researching and deciding what I should cover in which episodes. But you should be getting at least 2 more episodes about his crimes and his backstory, so stay tuned. If you thought this episode was a bit weird or wild, just wait. This is honestly one of the darker and more depraved crime sagas I've ever covered on this podcast. But until next time, I hope you all stay healthy, stay active, and most importantly, stay safe. I'll talk to you all later. Oh, hey again. Don't worry, I'm not here to tell you about the Avenger Initiative or try to sell you anything. I just have a little footnote that I wanted to add onto the story. Donna Cooper, the manager of the B. Dalton bookseller in the Fort Henry Mall, was the woman who helped lead investigators to Mike DeBardeleben. She's the quick-thinking woman who noticed that she had been handed a counterfeit bill, then alerted the Secret Service to the mall passer's presence in Tennessee back in May of 1983. For her effort in helping to detain this individual, she was presented with a $1,000 savings bond in recognition of her alertness and quick actions, helping to bring to justice one of the most prominent counterfeiters in U.S. history. Secret Service agent Thomas J. Bondurant later told Ms. Cooper, "I'm sure after that trial you realized how important this was to us. We might never have caught him in East Tennessee. You saved a lot of people from being victimized by this guy."